As someone who spends a lot of time analysing the factions to make army guides and such, I notice every little thing about them, and there's one faction that really stands out as being far more under-equipped and possibly the weakest faction in the game right now, just based on the roster and the units within it. So this isn't going to be a campaign or multiplayer specific thing, I'm just going to be talking about the factions in general. But before we get into the possible candidates for the weakest faction, let's look at some factions that definitely aren't the weakest, and why. First up, Kislev, one of the strongest factions going right now. They've got it all going on pretty much. They've got great infantry, lots of missiles all over the place, which are a lot of hybrid units of course, so plenty of versatility in the army. They do have the units to play defensively or aggressively if they want to. They've got some artillery they can sit back with, they've got plenty of missiles, or they can push up and be aggressive. They've also got a whole bunch of armor piercing with great weapon units and the Streltsy with their armor piercing missiles, so they've got that base covered. As well as anti-large, they've got all the missiles that can act as anti-large, they've got the bear cav that can act as anti-large, they've got the snow leopard. But for some of their downsides, apart from the bear cav, their cav is not that great at the moment, but I think that's more down to the issues with collision attacks for cavs and chariots. They should be way better, like the Griffon Legion should hit very hard, but they don't at the moment because things don't seem to be quite working properly, so that's a bit of a letdown for them for now. Hopefully when that's fixed, their cav will be stronger. They also lack any flying units really, and the magic is a bit lackluster, but other than that, Kislev, one of the strongest factions right now. Another faction that can be incredibly tough to stop is Khorne. They be absolutely raging. They're pretty much penned into the hyper-aggressive rush playstyle, which means they're very simple and very predictable, but goddamn are they good at that playstyle. They're very well built for what they do. It's a fairly well-rounded army. Despite lacking missile units, it still has the skull cannon, so it has that ranged capability a little bit. But they've got great anti-infantry with their infantry. They've got plenty of monsters that can serve as anti-infantry or anti-large. Great weapon minotaurs, absolute destroyers of large. They've also got halberds and bloodthirsters to that end. Most of their army has some good armor-piercing damage, or they have Frenzy, or they have Hellblade, so lots of damage-dealing potential from pretty much everything, at the expenses of some of their defenses, like not having a ton of melee defense, and there's not a lot of shields. They also have no magic, of course, but they more than make up for this with their damage-dealing potential, so Khorne can be an incredibly tough army to stop from absolutely murdering you, basically. And they've got one of the strongest lords in the freaking game, Scarbrand. And then there's the big boys, the ogres, another very well-rounded faction with lots of tools at their disposal. They can play the rush playstyle, they can play defensive, they could play somewhere in the middle. They of course have all of their big boy ogre infantry, which will smash puny human-sized infantry, and there's a variant for every occasion. Non-armor piercing, anti-large, ranged, they've got everything they need. They also have a good selection of cavalry and a good selection of monsters, again with lots of armor piercing, anti-large in there. They've also got plenty of ranged to act as anti-large as well, with the lead belchers, with the ogre pistols and the artillery. There's also sneaky units in the gorgers and the trappers. For downsides, they're a bit low in leadership in some areas and they don't have any flying units, but otherwise ogres are very well equipped and very good at playing however they like. So then to the last stronger faction, it's gotta be Tzeentch. A slightly more unconventional and maybe more difficult to play faction, but overall I think they've got everything they need there. They're an incredibly mobile faction with a lot of missile capabilities. Their infantry not designed to go up and start smashing other infantry on the front line, but to maybe skirmish a little bit and use up their ammo. All the while the mobility, the cav, the flying units, the monsters, they'll be picking the enemy apart while they're getting blasted by all these missiles. There's a fair lack of armor piercing throughout the army though, except for in some of the monsters and the flamers. If you can make good use of these, armor piercing is no problem. There is a lack of dedicated anti-large units though, with only the Soul Grinder's missile attack and the Screamers having anti-large bonuses, I think, but this is somewhat made up for by the ranged attacks of other units. The Doom Knights are a great unit that feel like they should either have armor piercing or an anti-large bonus, considering that they have a big old halberd, but alas, they have neither for some reason. But the faction with their high mobility, their barrier as well, and all of the magical power that they possess, they're able to survive and still be a pretty strong faction, despite being, as I say, quite unconventional. That leaves us with three then, Slaanesh, Cathay, and Nurgle. Who's got the biggest problems? Let's start by talking about Cathay. This is a faction that seems like it should be and could be one of the strongest. On paper, the roster and playstyle sounds great, and like they should be a super effective faction. Their infantry is clearly designed to be holding front lines. They're tough, they've got leadership, they've got armor, they've got melee defense. They're good for holding back anything coming towards them. They are not damage dealers though, so they're not going to win the battle by killing everything for you. That's the job of all the ranged units of Cathay. The crossbowmen, the armor-piercing celestial dragon crossbowmen, the crane gunners, the artillery, and of course the hot air balloons. And this is where all of their armor-piercing and anti-large power mostly is in the ranged units. And then they've got a little bit of cav for just harassing and playing a little bit aggressive around the flanks. And then of course there's some single entity power in the sentinels and the magic-y dragon lords as well. So as I say, that all sounds great on paper, right? But when you get into the battles, it doesn't quite work like that. Cathay's problems seem to stem from Warhammer 3's problems. And that's a combination of two things, I think. A, knockdown. Infantry units get knocked flying all over the place by even the lightest of cavalry. And this brings the second problem, that the units cannot hold their formation, they cannot hold that rectangle shape that you put them in, and thus the men end up all over the place with no sense of formation at all, and they can't really do anything effectively. And as you can imagine, this problem, coupled with the fact that Cathay's frontline infantry are supposed to hold everything back and stop them from getting to the missiles, well, they simply cannot protect all of their ranged power well enough. And if you take out all of Cathay's ranged power, you take out all of their damage dealing, and thus you're left with just infantry which cannot win the battle for you, because it's not designed to do that. The other issue for Cathay, when facing all the Chaos factions at least, is that Furies are a fucking nightmare. Not to mention doggo-type units as well. Furies can just fly over your stalwart defenses and just get all over your missiles and stop you from firing, and again, take away your damage dealing, thus making it difficult for you to execute the game plans and the playstyle that you're supposed to with Cathay. Now, it's not as much of an issue in campaign, but in multiplayer, it's a big issue, and it's very difficult to make Cathay work well, especially as you've got the battle harmony that you're supposed to try and keep working by keeping melee and missile units close to each other. It's difficult for Cathay. There's also the issue that, like I said earlier, collision attacks and charges from cavalry and chariots is still not really working great, so their cavalry is pretty underwhelming. Oh, and the hot air balloons can be absolutely massacred by one unit of Furies pretty much, so they're kind of really underwhelming too. So Cathay, despite having a nice roster, some nice units and a great game plan, it doesn't quite come off at the moment in Warhammer 3, and I think it's the issues with Warhammer 3 which are giving them the problems. But aside from that, it doesn't make them the weakest faction, it just does make life a little bit difficult for now. And speaking of the cavalry and chariot collision attack problems, this is also what's making Slanesh's life a little bit tougher, because half of the army is cavalry and chariots, and if they're not putting out damage correctly or well enough, it's difficult. Slanesh's army overall though is a pretty decent one, I think. It's got a lot of armor piercing, it's very fast, and you do have some anti-large in there as well. You've got some spears, you've got some spear cavalry, you've also got the soul grinder that's anti-large, so you've got a little bit of capabilities there. Maybe not enough for a faction that doesn't have any missiles to use as anti-large, but they do okay with it. Obviously, the blistering speed and flanking skills is what's important to Slanesh's army. You've also got some really great monsters for this faction, with the Keeper of Secrets, and the Fiends are pretty good too. So overall, a fairly decent roster, albeit maybe a bit of a thin one. As I say, it's mostly cavalry and chariots, and they're not really working properly, so I'm sure Slanesh players will look forward to a DLC to flesh the roster out a bit. Slanesh seems okay. Not the weakest faction, mostly having problems with the game being a little bit broken right now, which leaves only one then. It's Nurgle. Nurgle, I think, is the weakest faction in this game right now, and not because of anything broken about the game, but simply because the faction severely lacks a lot of tools, and their playstyle is pretty unconventional and almost counterintuitive, because they're kind of a rush faction that's really slow, and those two things don't really go together, right? But I think that's kind of a cool thing, and it gives a really different feel to the Nurgle faction. And it's not that they're completely a rush faction. They've got some artillery type attacks from Kugath and the Soul Grinder. Those are both anti-infantry though, so no anti-large type attacks from that. And their only missile attacks come from Exalted Plague Bearers, expensive, and Plague Drone Death Heads, expensive. So a major lack of missiles throughout the faction, but okay, they're a rush faction, that's supposed to kind of be how they are. But of course, missiles are a great tool for anti-large, which is something that this army would need, because they have literally no anti-large units, at least none with an anti-large bonus. Not one. So there's no dedicated anti-large units. Maybe the Plague Drone Deathheads with their armor-piercing missile are going to be the best thing you've got for a missile anti-large, and maybe the Great Unclean One, just because he can do so much armor-piercing damage. And it's kind of crazy that the Great Unclean One doesn't have an anti-large bonus, to be honest, because look at that freaking sword. It's taller than my house. I'm pretty sure if you swing that at a giant's leg, that leg's coming off. That's anti-large, my friend. Other than that, I feel like the only option you have is to take like 2 or 3 units of Beasts of Nurgle and then make them work together because they have armor piercing as well. And that brings us to the next problem. Armor piercing. There's very little of it in this army. You can get it from the monsters, you can get it from the flyers, but that's about it. And a lot of those are very expensive. Exalted Plaguebearer missile attack as well, but once again, that's goddamn expensive. But both of those weaknesses pale in comparison to their biggest one, which is missiles. Missiles will absolutely ruin them. The combination of having no armor, no shields, and being very slow means that Nurgle armies get absolutely torn apart by missiles, and especially by skirmishing. They can't catch anything, they just get shot to death. What can they do? Total War Warhammer has also become very much about mobility as well. Being able to have units that can get in and out of combat and in and out of bad and good matchups quickly is very beneficial, which again, for a slow army, does give them a bit of a struggle, and can lead to Nurgle armies being outmaneuvered, flanked, and hammer and anviled. Now, of course, Nurgle is negating some of this stuff by having large health pools, so they may get shot to crap, but they can take a bit of that punishment. They also get a melee defense bonus when in melee, so that helps them survive better if they can get to melee. They also have some healing, so they can still be pretty tough. It's not that the faction is completely useless or anything, but the tools that they have are severely lacking compared to other factions, I think. And the fix is probably just to add a few of these extra things in. Give that Great Unclean One an anti-large bonus. Give the Exalted Plaguebearers armor-piercing melee attacks, because they're an elite unit. They should probably have that. They have the armor-piercing missile attack, so why not the armor-piercing melee? But the one thing this faction probably needs more than anything is a missile resistance, because it absolutely ruins them. It might be weird to give them shields, so give them a missile resistance pretty much faction-wide. 15%, 20%, that should help them survive better and be much more effective at what they're trying to do. So overall, in their current state, with their lack of tools, I will say that Nurgle is the weakest faction, I think, by a fair shout. Again, it's not that they're completely useless, or that they can't win anything, or that their campaign is going to be super hard or something. It's just that comparing this faction to the other factions and what tools they all have, Nurgle seems to have drawn a bit of a short straw. I hope you've enjoyed this. Thanks for watching. I will see you in the future.